Good evening, everybody. Why don't we get started? It's 7 o'clock. I thought we'd start with just a interesting story about Blessed Simeon Cardon and companions. It's in the daily reflection in the Magnificat for June, and I thought this is the month of Corpus Christi, the feast of the Blessed Eucharist. I thought we would start with a story and then a prayer. So Simeon lived in 18th century France. He became a priest and courageously refused to take the oath of the civil constitution of the clergy during the French Revolution. In 1797, he went to Casa Maria, Italy, where he became the prior of a Cistercian abbey there. The French army was on campaign in Italy, and in 1799, a detachment of about 15 soldiers started pillaging monasteries there. The Benedictine Abbey of Monte Cassino, very famous, was ransacked. Many monks fled, but a few remained to defend the Eucharist. On the evening of May 12th, the soldiers arrived at Casa Abbey, and Father Simeon offered them hospitality, and the monks endeavored to explain that they had nothing to take, but the soldiers, possibly drunk, became violent and began to desecrate the church and everything in it. The monks tried to gather up the desecrated hosts, but the soldiers attacked them for doing that. Father Simeon initially hid in the garden, but then returned to his cell and faced the soldiers and eventually the sword. He lived about a day and told the French general about the massacre before he died. Many miracles attended the relics of those martyred monks, so much so that in 1854, the abbot ordered the martyred monks to stop it. The miracle ceased. Later, he lifted his command, and the miracles began again. And in 2021, Pope Francis beatified the martyrs of Casa Maria. So just a wonderful reflection on devotion to the Eucharist and the lengths at which the saints and the blessed go to defending the sacred hosts. And so with that, let's pray the collect. I'll pray the collect of the Mass of Corpus Christi. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. O God, who in this wonderful sacrament has left us a memorial of your passion, grant us, we pray, so to revere the sacred mysteries of your body and blood, that we may always experience in ourselves the fruits of your sacrifice and of your redemption, who live and reign with God the Father in the unity of the Holy Spirit, God forever and ever. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. So this is our second class on our theme for the summer, which is a guide for the perplexed, gaining perspective from historical crises in the church for today's anxious Catholics. And we covered the introduction to this last class, where we focused on ancient problems in the church of early Gnosticism, which was a philosophical movement really out of a pagan culture that denigrated the body to the exclusion of everything else, and that all that really mattered was my spiritual self. My body, creation, matter was inherently corrupt, evil, at war with the spirit. And this forced the church to clarify who Jesus was and is. It forced the church to clarify the canon of the Old and New Testament at that point in time, which was later made official at the Council of Trent in the 16th century. However, local councils would identify the books of the New Testament that they believed to be inspired. So what we see often is heresy or conflict often forces the church to clarify itself. So what we will examine, I always have to use the red pointer at least once. We're now in class 2, an ongoing kind of reflection on the crises that happened between the 2nd and 5th century, particularly as Constantine conquers and becomes first the Western emperor and then the entire emperor of the entire Roman Empire, what that meant for the church. Some good things, some bad things. So with that, as I've mentioned, you think about the early church, it confronted serious problems from the beginning. And one of them we haven't talked about much is, what do we do with the Gentiles? The majority of the converts to early Christianity from the apostles were Jewish. And the question arose, as we saw in Acts of the Apostles, when Peter and Paul were arguing over, should the Gentiles be circumcised? Should they have a special diet like Jewish people do? And we saw how that was resolved at the Council of Jerusalem. The other thing we did spend some time on in the other class last week is, who is Jesus Christ? Do we slot him into kind of a pantheon of pagan gods, which is what we would expect him to be from a secular point of view, or is he something quite unique, namely the Son of God and man, true God, true man? What is he? Which is he? And we saw that the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD clarified that by saying God, Jesus Christ, is true God, true man. As I've mentioned, in this confrontation with heresy, error, confusion, the church clarifies its self-understanding. And I've mentioned a couple of examples of that. But what comes out of that is, for us, we're always on the way. The term "we're on a journey" is overused, but we are in the sense of we're always living a life in the time we are in conflict of some kind or another. And so that's just the way it is. We haven't been rescued from the encounter with a world that doesn't care a bit about Catholic faith or the Catholic Church. Ancient Gnosticism is what I'll call the first installment of this perpetual conflict the Church has with pagan culture. It will continue from there to our time. It never really goes away. And when you think about it, and I'll touch on this in this class and in the next, starting with the Last Supper, where Judas is set to betray Jesus, there was problems. Jesus was the first vocation director who picked a bad priest. And so it will continue. And then we get another double down on that when all the apostles run on Good Friday evening. Peter denies Jesus 3 times. So not exactly off to a good start, are we? And yet we somehow think, well, all that's going to be behind us now that the Roman Catholic Church is underway. Well, as we are seeing, that's really not the case, and we shouldn't have that expectation that it ever is the case. The new Gnosticisms we'll really get to in Class 5 that I mentioned there. It'll be the last topic in mid-July that we cover. But one of the common things about Gnosticisms, old and new, is a frustration with the state of creation. You might remember the early Gnostics said that creation was the result of a bad God creating it, and that the Old Testament described all of the events of that bad creator God. He's a jealous God. He's whimsical. Abraham and Jonah talk him out of destroying cities and bargain with him. Will you keep the city alive if there are 50 innocent people? Okay, I will. The bargaining with God. I am a jealous God. You shall have no gods before me. The ancient Gnostics thought that's a crazy idea of who God is. Jealous, capricious, violent. That's not the God that we want to worship. So there's a frustration with creation for the ancient Gnostics. For the ancient Gnostics, as I mentioned, there was this, one side was incredibly ascetic to the point of the destruction of the human. So no sex, no marriages, no children. The end times are coming next week. There's another side which is very immoral, and the famous expression, nothing is impure for the pure. So they can do anything and remain pure. And these have modern day analogs, resonances today I identified a few last week, but in the worshiping Mother Earth to the destruction of the human, in the extreme forms of the global warming, climate change movement, through the sexual revolutions that we're living through that started in the 60s, of course, and have continued into our times. They have this common theme of hatred of humanity and immorality. Pascal described these types of pagans and materialists as those who would lick the earth. And we celebrate the 400-year anniversary of Pascal's death, so in 1623. But continuing, prior to Constantine, so Constantine was a 4th century emperor in Rome who eventually instituted Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. But prior to that, the church was on the run. It was a covert, underground church. The first 21 popes were martyred. Not a very stable job situation there. When career counselors ask you, when you're interviewing for a new job, why is the position open? Oh, well, the last 20 were killed, but you'll do fine. But we see a Christian identity emerging, even in the 1st century. For example, when you had the Great Fire in Rome in the 60s AD, the Christians were identified as the culprits of setting that fire, in distinction from the Jewish people. So by the 60s, the Roman authorities were making a distinction between Christians and Jews. You had the eventual destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD, never to be rebuilt. And then certainly by the 3rd century, some of the sociological studies of research analysts, Christianity was becoming much more a cultural force in a what I'll call dying pagan society in Rome. Archaeologically, we start to see a transition from home churches to actual standalone buildings that are churches. Now, in an underground society, that's hard to pull off. You probably have to do the old, switcheroo on the storefront, or a back alley entrance kind of situation. But what's interesting is Christianity starts to emerge architecturally as well. And certainly then with Constantine, the building projects took off in the 4th century. Nevertheless, you have this decentralized model still of governance, meaning that the local bishop or synods of bishops in the area were really running the church. There was no grand authority like we think of today in the Pope running the show for simple logistics reasons. Transportation lead times could take days, weeks, months. You wrote a letter about a priest abusing the liturgy. That letter might take several months to get to the Pope if he ever even saw it. So you were really working on the local scene for the most part. As I mentioned here, Rome to Alexandria, one of the major seas of the ancient world, was 1,300 miles by boat, 2,500 miles by land. That would take months to communicate. So just by circumstance, most, if not everything, was decentralized. And so what's incubating for decades and centuries prior to Constantine is practices grow up. Some of them in line with Orthodoxy, some of them just crazy, as we'll see. They incubated, as I mentioned, liturgical variants. We now have texts of lectionaries and sacramentaries from the 2nd, 3rd century that have bizarre rites and rituals in them, as well as things that we would recognize today, which is also very fascinating. You have strange doctrines on the Trinity, Jesus being feminine, no references to the Holy Spirit. You have a mix of ancestor worship, worshiping the dead in a pagan-like way, mixed into elements in the Mass or in other new and different sacraments. So very interesting what's incubating. It's like ignoring your attic for 25 years and then you go up there to see what's up there. It's a little bit what was happening in the church at that time. As I mentioned on the next slide, the privileges of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, were emerging. Think of the letters of Clement in 90 AD to the church in Corinth, trying to correct abuses there. So even in 90 AD, the Bishop of Rome felt it his responsibility to correct abuses outside of Rome. Interesting. And Clement was thought to have been baptized by Peter. You have the letters of Ignatius of Antioch in around 105 AD, writing to the different churches, encouraging them in the faith, telling them to be faithful to their bishop, talking about the Eucharist and baptism, all in the early church. Also what emerges is Alexander, Antioch, Jerusalem, and major parts of North Africa were hugely influential in the development of the theology of the church at this time. They were a bit more isolated, and historically, politically, they were always kind of independent, dependent on Rome. They were always in soft rebellion, and so naturally, when Roman Catholicism and Christianity became generally the official religion, there were disputes from the same crowd of people. They were a bit, hard-nosed and not going to take orders from Rome just because it's from Rome. So we'll see some of that later. Now, Constantine's victories, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, some of you might remember that in 311, where he conquers against his western opponent. He becomes the emperor in the west. Then in 324, he becomes emperor of the entire Roman Empire and moves his capital to Constantinople in 330. That will be very important for Class 3 on what that will mean for the East and the West as time goes on, and that schism that eventually occurs between East and West. Nevertheless, the church all of a sudden receives security from Constantine, financial support, building projects, and the awarding of dioceses to candidates, and therein lies the politics that creep in as well. Nevertheless, Constantine looked across the empire, saw all these disputes that had been underground forever, and he saw no unity politically, religiously in the empire. These fights and disputes would spill over into military conflicts. These were not just theological debates that we are going to review. These debates often led to bloodshed. So the people were very much interested, involved, motivated about what we're about to cover. The emperor, Constantine, and his successors says, we can't have these people, these crazy theologians, killing each other over homoousion versus homoiousion. I mean, that's ridiculous. That's crazy. Why would anyone go to war for that? So we'll cover that. As I mentioned here, this created a drumbeat that the church will suffer under for at least 1,800, well, it will be 1,800 years to this day, but at least 1,500 years. Emperors meddling in the selection of bishops, theology, worship. Should you worship with statues or not? The meddling never stopped. In France, for example, up until the 19th century, the French leadership, the French kings, picked all the bishops. We saw a deal negotiated with Pope Francis and China that allowed for some kind of détente by which the Chinese political leadership would select a list of bishops that the Pope could pick from. That has subsequently broken down to the Chinese leadership now is just picking and ordaining the bishops without Pope Francis's input. So these themes, you might think this is historical, this is way back when, it has no application to today. What I'm trying to tell you is that no, this is living, breathing today. It has never stopped. And so we tend to idealize former times. Why can't we just get back to 1955? It's never been like that. So we shouldn't fool ourselves, and part of the goal of this course is to make you aware that the church has always been in one conflict or another. As I mentioned, the goal was unity in doctrine and practice, and I mentioned that Constantine started endowing locations: Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, places in North Africa, places in Italy, places in Gaul. And what began to happen is the new leadership in the church saw a chance, in some cases, to cash in. And so many candidates that were selected to become bishops may not have even understood what the Catholic faith is. There are many stories in particular Henry Chadwick's book that's in the bibliography of these candidates who were made bishops were unsavory people, to say the least. There are stories where they would charge for funerals and funeral masses, console the families, and then at night dig up the bodies and rob them of the jewelry. In other cases, bishops would, in order to pay compensation to family members, would force priests and religious women to be prostitutes and then take the monies earned and dole that out to family members. In other cases, bishops would be guilty of murder or conducting abortions. And so this isn't obviously necessarily a majority type situation, but it's noteworthy enough that it survives in the records and is commented on by historians of the time. St. John Chrysostom, the Patriarch of Constantinople in the 5th century, noted this as well. And in fact, he was run out of Constantinople eventually for commenting on the abuses not only of clergy, but of the royal family in Constantinople, and that he was gotten rid of and exiled. So this is the church coming out of the hands of Constantine and the empire. And I mention this because historical books are written, and there's one that just came out by Peter Heather, who's a classical historian, on something like the invention of Christianity. And where does he start? In 300 AD. So he's completely ignorant of the workings of the church from 0 to 300, a church born in weakness, a covert underground church running for its life, with the first 21 popes martyred. But he thinks, oh no, Christianity really started, and Catholicism in particular, that ugly thing, started with Constantine. For those of us who've watched the 2014 series on Fathers of the Church, which is on YouTube, if you go to YouTube and put in Church of St. Mary, Summer School of Faith, and go to the 2014 class, you will see that in the first 250 years of the church, we have the emergence of the primacy of the Bishop of Rome, not in its full formulation, of course. We have the emergence of the hierarchical nature of the church. Baptism, Eucharist, confession, other sacraments are noted at that time. We know, for example, from the Didache from about 55 AD, descriptions of baptism, the Eucharist, the role of the bishop. All of this is ignored by people with an axe to grind, like Peter Heather and other historians from the UK, who have suffered enough being brought up in the Anglican Church. So we will review 3 early heresies that are fun and juicy. I hope you enjoy them, but they do reveal our times as well. Montanism is the first one. Privileged visions of the perfect, in quotes, versus the grubby, messy, dirty apostolic succession. So let's jump in. Mid-2nd century, schismatic sect out of Western Turkey, led by Montanus, and he had the disciples Maximilla and Priscilla. Very popular, very anti-authoritarian. They felt revelation was really more about their personal ecstasies and prayer and private revelations, which they then preached as prophecy. As I mentioned, they're rigorous, ascetical, no laughing, no talking, none of that. Disgusted by the corruption of the local clergy. This will be a common theme throughout of a lot of these separatist movements start out of a disgust with what they perceive to be lax morality. As I mentioned, celibacy for the perfect. All of these apocalyptic movements always have the highest rung and then the hoi polloi rungs. The special, the supreme, the perfect, the grand marshals, the grand visors, and so on. No second marriages if you're going to marry at all. The end times are near. And if you're a Gnostic, why would you want to perpetuate creation? Why would you, the evil God said, be fruitful and multiply as a deception. If creation is evil, why would you want to reproduce? Why would you want to have a family? Certain sins could never be forgiven by the church, such as apostasy, adultery of certain clergy, never forgiven in this life. You face God, but we can't forgive you. They had the bizarre practice of baptizing corpses because they felt that there was a in-between existence between your final state and death. Early on, people thought, well, there's this interesting, bizarre passage in the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 15, verse 29, of talking about the undead. We immediately think that's a Netflix series. But what Paul was referring to is unclear, and the Montanists took that and ran with it and baptized corpses. Tertullian, a father of the church, was a Montanist for a while before he came back to Orthodoxy, as we will see. Now, this movement eventually died out like a lot of these things, but would come back together in the future under different leaderships. Nevertheless, it did force people like Irenaeus to clarify what are the four Gospels. Hadn't been done before. We take that for granted, but it's actually, in many ways, the kill shot on Bible-only faiths. Because the question we always ask Bible-only faiths are, who wrote your table of contents? We won't debate who wrote Mark or Luke or the letters of Paul. Just tell me who wrote the table of contents, and are they inspired or not? And how can that happen if we're Bible-only? So, again, we get into these contradictory loops, which, as Catholics, we don't have to engage on because the apostolic tradition precedes the writing and the formation of the New Testament by at least 100 years. What were Catholics doing in the first century with no Bibles? The apostles were saying, look at how we live, look at how we preach, look at what we're doing. Apostolic tradition, oral tradition. I mentioned Tertullian. Here's a quote from his work against heretics. He was trained legally in Roman law, was a Western father, one of the first to write in Latin. And he wrote, like a lawyer in some ways, by saying heretics have no standing before the court. It'd be like me suing someone in Ohio for their loud music they're playing in some neighborhood in Cleveland. I live in Illinois. I have no standing to make that complaint. So, quote, "But if there be any heresies which are bold enough to plant themselves in the midst of the apostolic age, that they may say thereby seem to have been handed down by the apostles, because they existed in the time of the apostles, we can say, let them produce the original records of their churches. Let them unfold the roll of their bishops, running down in due succession from the beginning in such a manner that that first bishop of theirs that bishop shall be able to show for his ordained predecessor some one of the apostles or of apostolic men, a man, moreover, who continued steadfast with the apostles. For this is the manner in which the apostolic churches transmit their registers, as the church of Smyrna, which records that Polycarp was placed therein by John, as also the church of Rome, which makes Clement to have been ordained in like manner by Peter. In exactly the same way the other churches likewise exhibit, whom, as having been appointed to their episcopal places by apostles, they regard as transmitters of the apostolic seed. You see how early this is, and there's no reference yet to the New Testament in this description of standing. Who has the authority to explain what we believe and how we practice our faith? Continuing, let the heretics contrive something of the same kind. For after their blasphemy, what is there that is unlawful for them to attempt? But should they even effect the contrivance, they will not advance a step. For their very doctrine, after comparison with that of the apostles, will declare by its own diversity and contrariety that it had for its author neither an apostle nor an apostolic man. Because as the apostles would never have taught things which were self-contradictory, so the apostolic men would not have inculcated teaching different from the apostles, unless they who received their instructions from the apostles went and preached in a contrary manner. You see what he is setting up? We talked about this apostolic succession in the last class, being our connection back to Christ and the Holy Spirit that he sent to guide the church. If you are not connected to that apostolic succession, just as that extension cord only powers that computer if it's connected to the power source, so too we have no power if we're not connected to the apostolic succession. So that's the spinal cord of Catholicism, if you will. So to wrap up this text, then let all the heresies, when challenged to these two tests by our apostolic church, offer their proof of how they deem themselves to be apostolic. But in truth, they neither are so, nor are they able to prove themselves to be what they are not. Nor are they admitted to peaceful relations and communion by such churches as are in any way connected with apostles, inasmuch as they are in no sense themselves apostolic, because of their diversity as to the mysteries of faith. By differing from what the apostles and their successors in union with them preached, that diversity in and of itself demonstrates they've been cut off. Powerful stuff, a key text that narrates the apostolic succession. I would mention the letters of Clement, written around 95 AD, mention the same concept. Apostolic succession. Very important. So, Tertullian was a Montanist who eventually reformed, renewed himself, and became a full member of the Catholic Church. If we move on to the next one, Arianism. Arianism is what prompted the Council of Nicaea in 325. Arius was a very popular preacher. It's interesting how the heretics, the lead heretic is often probably the most talented guy in his area. An effective preacher, articulate, theologically sophisticated, and yet wrong. And as St. Jerome mentioned, certainly by the mid-4th century, the majority of the bishops in the world were Arian, were heretical. Even after Nicaea, the majority. What was the key thing that Arianism and Arius were proposing? It was not credible for Arius to believe that Jesus Christ was truly God. A true God would not cry at the death of Lazarus. He would not commerce with sinners, prostitutes. He would not be thirsty on the cross. That's not becoming of God. God would not engage with corrupt matter or the body in that way. Jesus being hungry after 40 days in the desert, fighting the devil? God has to fight with the devil? God is hungry? That would be offensive to a Greek mind where God is perfect. So the church had to deal with this. And there were different forms of Arianism that Jesus is adopted the day he's baptized by John the Baptist. So no pre-existence as God, but rather he, or through his own self-consciousness over time, becomes aware of his divinity. And that's what makes him divine. All these are heresies. Some of them make it into preaching today, unfortunately. But nevertheless, the seminary is working on that and correcting those abuses. We hear homilies about, on Father's Day, Joseph being the earthly father of Jesus. Joseph is not the earthly father of Jesus, he is the earthly foster father of Jesus. So, Constantine is watching these crazy theologians bashing their heads, fighting each other, military murders, and he calls the Council of Nicaea. He's going to slam heads together and say, write me a creed. And I am not exaggerating. And so they did, and what emerged is the beautiful creed of the Council of Nicaea. Orthodox and a beautiful statement and rejection of Arianism. Nevertheless, Arianism will linger for at least another 100 to 150 years, if not longer. Does Jesus have a human intellect? Does Jesus have a human will? Those issues are yet to be debated. What does it mean for Jesus to be human? Okay, we've nailed it that he is divine. Great. Was he really surprised when the woman touched his cloak and he says, who touched me? Remember the woman with the hemorrhage? Was he really surprised? Did he really suffer on the cross? This is all going to be worked out in future councils, in future heresies. So, as I mentioned here, Nicaea resolves one question and opens up 15 other questions. As a famous theologian once said, councils are not an ending, they're a beginning. What's interesting to note for our time, because I'll now make an application to the synodal way and the German synod. As I mentioned, the position taken at Nicaea is an abject evidence of the work of the Holy Spirit, because many of the bishops were not even Orthodox. They were Arian. The good news is Constantine was open to either path, and he was persuaded by an Orthodox group of bishops, and that's what won the day, a minority opinion. And so when you hear expressions about lived experiences or synodal ways that take excessive soundings of people who are not even active Catholics, that is misguided. I mentioned a Pew poll last class and in past classes that over 65% of church-going Catholics do not believe in the real presence of the Eucharist. Should we tap their lived experience of their understanding of the Eucharist? You see what a folly that methodology is if pursued excessively. So there are obvious parallels when we look at Nicaea and how that creed was formed to looking at today. When you are looking at synodal ways and synodality, don't ask me to pronounce that again. But when you are looking at that, the lived experience of people is always subject to the critique of divine revelation on faith and morals. It is not some independent, autonomous source of revelation. It never is. It's interesting. It can be relevant in formulations that people would understand better, but it's not something separate and distinct from the life of the church. And so that is something to watch as these synods proceed do they stay on the rails or not? We'll know that when at the end of that process, the Pope typically issues an apostolic exhortation, which is a cleanup of everything that went before, to ensure that there's clarity of what we're talking about on the issues that they will be talking about. You know, there's a number of them. We won't go into them. But I'll give you another example. The U.S. bishops just produced a document, I think it's in its final form, on Catholic hospitals not performing surgeries that mutilate children, aka trans surgeries. Very good statement. There were bishops present, some with red hats, who said we should also include the lived experience of transgendered people in any statement. And it's unclear what that even would mean, unless he's talking about survivors who wanted to go back and wanted to sue their doctor. That could be, I don't think that's the voice he had in mind, though. So you see how these issues from 4th century replay today under different names, different approaches, different issues. So things to keep in mind. Not just history, but perspective for today from history. Third one, Donatism. Not donuts. Donatism is ordering more than 4 donuts. No. Which I would be guilty of. But Donatus, or Donatus, was Bishop of Carthage. Again, North Africa, another one of these rebellious provinces vis-a-vis Rome. He died in exile in 355, but was disgusted by the bishops and priests who collapsed under the persecutions of Diocletian, who was emperor of Rome in between. The persecutions anywhere were between 303 and 311 AD, which were violent and extreme. Nevertheless, Donatus was disgusted by the collapse. What was the collapse? Bishops handing over the sacred books, the Old and New Testament versions that they had, or prayer books, liturgical works, or ratting on other Christians. Turning over sacred vessels, or compromising, saying, you leave us alone and we'll shut down the church. Sound familiar? Many of the bishops were on record saying, we're just going to ride out the controversy. Diocletian will pass away at some point. It might be 10, 15 years before we have masses again, but at least we're on good terms with this crazy emperor. And so, too, the bishops in the U.S., between 2020 and most of 2021, in different ways, every diocese handled it a bit differently, closed their churches. No masses. Many co-workers who saw their parents, family members die 50 yards away behind glass in Catholic hospitals, never to be recovered. So these things have historical resonances, and we shouldn't forget them, yesterday or 2 years ago. Donatus and his followers regarded such actions as apostasy, disqualifying. And so it raised the question, what is their sacramental power? Oh, you want to come back. Diocletian is gone. The church isn't under fire anymore. You want to come back. You can understand in a human way if you've had maybe your hands cut off or your tongue cut off and you suffered and survived. When the others came back out of hiding, you might have an axe to grind. However, it led Donatus into heresy, because he said, if you are morally compromised, your sacraments are invalid. Because you lied, were a coward, your sacraments are invalid. Your baptisms, your ordinations are not valid. And This caused a problem for the church, for the empire. Nevertheless, the Donatists said that, well, you Catholic Orthodox types have entered into this evil relationship with the emperor. And all the money he's giving you to build these nice churches which you abandoned are just bribes. And even that, we had the clarity of this heretic of what does the emperor have to do with the church? A very good question, by the way. And in the end, he said, I am greater than the emperor, which prefigures a lot of medieval Catholicism, early medieval Catholicism. He's ahead of his time in seeing this for what it is. Unfortunately, he took it too far and had a heretical sacramental theology of saying that the spiritual character of the priest determines whether his Eucharist is valid or not. But it wasn't just a theological debate. These people were quite serious, and they were violent. They attacked churches. They would burn them to the ground. They would attack bishops and priests and sometimes murder them, sometimes by lynching them, other times by burning them. They wouldn't sell, Carthage was a huge source of grain to the Roman Empire, and a lot of the bread, the Eucharistic bread, came from Carthage, and they shut down exports. If they did take over a church, they would disinfect it to clear it of the pus and grime of Catholic liturgies conducted by unworthy priests and bishops. And they excluded Catholics from burials. After a time, Rome and the imperial authorities intervened, and they started executing the leaders of the movement. Nevertheless, it fed the narrative that Catholics are just an instrument of Rome. As I mentioned, Catholic works, churches, food pantries, even hospitals were just bribes from the empire to serve the poor. Bishops receiving stipends from the empire, he equated to prostitutes, taking their money from the pimp. Numidia was probably the most violent, and Numidia was always the most violent toward Rome, pre-Constantine as well. Think of the Punic Wars. And they would throw themselves off of cliffs if they were being encroached on by Roman authorities and be declared martyrs. And they would blame the Catholics in their festivals and ceremonies. The most violent branch of the Donatists were what were called circumcellions, the wanderer-abouts, the men who were homeless gangs preying on Catholic villages and towns, destroying the churches and synagogues. They would chase bishops out of their cities, and they were the shock troops of the Donatists, and they were the ones that would lynch bishops and priests. So you see, even at this time, things are not settled. Things are not in any way stable in the church. The decline really comes after these killings of a particular bishop finally went too far, and you have the rise of St. Augustine, who confronted the Donatists specifically. Augustine knew the Donatists very well because they were in North Africa, as he was. He was in Hippo, and the Donatists came out of Carthage. He saw that there were actually good Donatists who were moderate, who didn't believe in the violence, but did want to reform the clergy. And then there was another faction that was much more extreme and violent. The issue of sacraments, Augustine was quite clear on, that it was on the action of Christ through the minister, not the worthiness of the minister. The question of where is the church to be found? The arguments around Rome versus Numidia, and Augustine made the joke that it's hard to believe that Peter wasn't the foundation of the apostles, but oh no, we were wrong all along, it was Numidia. So that had some humor, some rare humor for Augustine. And then by the 5th century, early 400s, Augustine has developed his theology of grace, theology of the sacraments, of the worthiness of the minister as an instrument of Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit, but not the condition of validity. And there was another question that came up of should conversions be coerced at the point of a sword? And Augustine was of two minds of this, and eventually was, no, we should not coerce people to convert, which would later make its way and influence international law as formed by Gratian, who's the father of international law. So international law is a product of Catholic social thought, just as an FYI. So, the Council of Carthage in 411 AD. A large assembly, probably one of the largest councils ever held, but it was not an ecumenical council. It was really one of those local councils called to solve problems. And there happened to be an equal number on both sides of 286 Catholic bishops and 285 Donatists, so one more. But the real guarantor was what I call the muscle, Tribune Marcellinus, who was there to enforce what was decided on. There evidently were several cohorts of Roman soldiers nearby to deal with any problems, which reminds you of several ecumenical councils being conducted that way as well. But that's another time, another class. So, Christ affects the grace of the sacrament through the instrument of the priest, provided he intends, the priest, to do what the church intends. This is a very interesting distinction that emerges in this council. The priest doesn't have to be in the state of grace. The priest might have slept through seminary class and has no idea what the Mass is. As long as he intends to do what the church intends in that act of consecration, the grace of the real presence is effective. The consecration achieves its goal of the body and blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ being truly present under the appearances of bread and wine. So the efficacy of the sacraments, this used to be known in catechism class of years ago, ex opere operato, from the work having been worked, not from the intention, the worthiness of the priest. The act of consecration, with the priest intending to do what the church intends, is sufficient for validity. Huge clarification forced on the church by the Donatists. What is the church? The church is not simply one local church, came out of this council. It is a body across the world. When we talk about the West-East split next class, this understanding will come back into play of how the East regards church and how the Western church regards the church as a universal body throughout the world. Lastly, Augustine says something very interesting. All believers have a priestly mission, not just clerics. All believers have a priestly mission, a theme that Vatican II will develop at length when it talks about the universal call to holiness, much needed now in our time, not just for clerics, for all of us. So Catholicism, the Catholic position, was affirmed by the majority and some Donatist bishops in the presence of the tribune. Augustine offered to have everyone say Mass together. It was rejected by the Donatists. And that was the end of that. Donatists, really, that was too much for them at that moment. But we got resolution on some key and core questions of sacraments and the church. So we just quickly went through three heresies. Before I get to summary on lessons learned, any questions on what we've covered so far? Yes.
So my question,
It would depend, but there was confusion. But sometimes take for example Athanasius, who was a very Orthodox bishop of the 4th century who fought for the Orthodoxy of Nicaea, and he was kicked out of his diocese 5 times and had to hide in the mountains. And sometimes the people would express their rebellion against that because he was replaced by an Arian bishop, because that's who the emperor wanted. And other times they would acquiesce because there was not enough of a majority at the level of a person who had no power in society anyway to make real change unless you wanted to belong to a mob that did things violently. So it was still an argument among elites, though the people cared, depending on if it affected their devotional life, prayer life. But the debates on Arianism was a theological debate that had political implications. And the people would react based upon where they were locally. So there was no hard and fast, if you did this, then the people rebelled. You know, how many were troops barracked there? If they were, your interest in rebelling might be less. Yes? Oh, yep. Yes.
Did they not believe in the Pope then as the
So
church?
I would say at this time, they certainly were aware of a bishop of Rome, but he was 800 miles away. So you always have to remember that time versus our time. They might not even know his name. For example, there's some historical evidence to show that the Pope wasn't even aware that a council was being held in Nicaea or Constantinople in 381 AD until after the fact. So you can't take our time and place and then cut and paste it back 1,600 years ago.
So the only reason all these Catholics and Donatists show up in one place is because they were told to.
So some of them were as disgusted as Donatus was. So think of it as an organic local movement that started to gain momentum. But think of it as movements today. I'm trying to think of an example, but it could be the Antifa movement. It's hard to pin down who's running Antifa because when they interview members of Antifa, which is the violent group in our culture today, there is no one leader. So there's local chapters that may or may not coordinate, but there's no leader of Antifa. Yes?
Where was Constantine before he moved to Constantinople?
Rome.
And why did he move?
Because he had visited Constantinople, it wasn't called that until he put a city there, and loved it was easily defended off the Bosporus River. It was right on a port area, and he wanted to be in a new place. And so there were military advantages to being there. Rome is kind of a awkward place to defend. And frankly, a lot of the emperors didn't spend a lot of time in Rome anyway. So he wanted to move east, and he did that in 335. Or 330 AD, moved the capital there. Why don't we wrap up with some summary and lessons learned? Oh, good. So, from the beginning, Christianity labored under strife, scandal of its leadership, misunderstandings of doctrine and practice. There was no utopian time that we might hark back to. There were conflicts. As I mentioned, it started with the Last Supper and went downhill from there. Sometimes people say, why didn't Jesus straighten things out from the beginning? Couldn't he just hand down a set of what I call fully baked procedures, doctrines to resolve all conflicts for all time? But when you think about that, how could he even be understood if he tried? A bunch of fishermen who spoke Aramaic. The question kind of answers itself, doesn't it? because we are temporal human beings. We live in time progressively. You're not the same person you were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I can tell you that by my vertical leap on the basketball court. So it's an impossible utopian fantasy. Heretical movements often start with being disgusted by the fact that we have to have a church of saints and sinners. Certain types resent how earthy and smarmy, I put, certain people in the church are. Sinners. Why allow the weeds to grow up in the garden in the first place? And the solutions are often perfectionist, draconian, apocalyptic at this time and now. The world is going to end in 7 years. That's not a quote from the Donatists, that's a quote from a modern day politician. So shock value, then and now, apocalyptic, crisis, conflict. That's the paradigm, vocabulary of these heretical movements. That said, development of doctrine is inherent for Christianity. Given that Jesus didn't lay out a handbook discovered in a forest or dictated to one person, rather, what characterizes Judeo-Christian revelation is it's public. Not one person. Jesus said to his accusers, every day I preached and taught and healed in your cities, and you arrest me at night? Our revelation, our faith, is based upon it being vetted. We aren't relying on, someone wrote this book for me, and here it is. It's a public ministry. We have Gospels written relatively contemporaneously after the events. Still, there's this utopian demand by some that all human institutions stink. They're all inherently corrupt. The church is a man-made institution simply about power and control. And so we need to get past that. We need to reject this stinky institution and rely on God's undefiled word. Very popular in Christian circles. There's just one little detail. That stinky, defiled institution produced the texts of the New Testament. So what's protected again by the Holy Spirit? Can you point to a version of Matthew's gospel from the hand of Matthew? Does one exist? No. So we are always already involved in the holy and the unholy blended together. As I put it, imperfect vessels and feet of clay can still cooperate with God's purposes to preach the gospel. This is the idea of sacramentality, that the physical, the human, the created can be cooperative with the divine. The human doesn't defeat the divine, but rather God enters into human history, takes on a human nature, and redeems it. This is beautifully expressed by a work by then probably Father Ratzinger in 1968 when he wrote this. And we have time. Quote, and this is from his book, Introduction to Christianity. It's in the chapter on the church toward the back of the book. For many people today, the church has become the main obstacle to belief. Keep in mind, this was written in 1968. The main obstacle to belief. They can no longer see anything but the human struggle for power. The petty spectacle of those who claim to administer official Christianity seem to stand in the way of the true spirit of Christianity. How can we reply? The word holy does not apply in the first place to the holiness of the human persons, but refers to the divine gift which bestows holiness in the midst of unholiness. It is really and truly the holiness of the Lord that becomes present in it, and that chooses again and again as the vessel of its presence, with a paradoxical love, the dirty hands of men. Incidentally, this will form the basis of his works on the liturgy. Namely, the liturgy is not first the work of the community. The liturgy is Jesus Christ's adoration and worship of the Father, which we participate in. That's what participation means in Vatican II. We are participating in Christ's adoration of the Father, sacramentally, the holy sacrifice of the Mass, the representation of Good Friday and Easter Sunday on the altar. The community only has meaning, its lived experience only has meaning in connection to Christ's act of adoration of the Father. So that will come later, but you see the germ of it in the writing here in 1968. Continuing, it is a holiness that radiates as the holiness of Christ in the midst of the church's sin, the existing interplay of God's loyalty and man's disloyalty, which characterizes the structure of the church, is grace in dramatic form, through which the reality of grace, as the pardoning of those who are in themselves unworthy, continually becomes visibly present in history. Now, in contrast to this description, he talks about the utopian view from a human perspective. In the human dream of a perfect world, he's probably thinking of communism in particular, but in the human dream of a perfect world, and think of the utopian fantasies we just covered, holiness is always visualized as untouchability by sin and evil, as something unmixed with the latter. There always remains in some form or other a tendency to think in terms of black and white, a tendency to cut out and reject mercilessly the current form of the negative. In contemporary criticism of society and in the actions in which it vents itself, this merciless side, always present in human ideals, is once again only too evident. And we see this today as well. Say the wrong thing, think the wrong thing, and you are canceled and possibly fired from work. In California, if you show insufficient enthusiasm for transgenderism, your children can be taken from you. So you see, this notion of the perfect society is relentless and merciless. That is why the aspect of Christ's holiness that upset his contemporaries was the complete absence of this condemnatory note. Fire did not fall on the unworthy, nor were the zealous allowed to pull up the weeds, which they saw growing luxuriantly on all sides. On the contrary, this holiness expressed itself precisely as mingling with sinners, whom Jesus drew into his vicinity, as mingling to the point where he himself was made to be sin, and bore the curse of the law in execution as a criminal. Complete community of fate with the lost. He has drawn sin to himself, made it his lot, and so revealed what true holiness is. Not separation, but union. Not judgment, but redeeming love. Is the church not simply the continuation of God's deliberate plunge into human wretchedness? Is it not simply the continuation of Jesus' habit of sitting at table with sinners, of his mingling with the misery of sin to the point where he actually seems to sink under its weight? Is there not revealed in the unholy holiness of the church, as opposed to man's expectations of purity, God's true holiness, which is love, love which does not keep its distance in a sort of aristocratic, untouchable purity, but mixes with the dirt of the world in order to overcome it? I must admit that to me this unholy holiness of the church has in itself something infinitely comforting about it. Written in 1968, during the student riots in Germany, and during the beginning of the chaos of the implementation of Vatican II, both in theological faculties and in the liturgy. He was on the front lines, he saw it, and he wrote this work as a corrective to what he saw happening. So a superficial, rigid orthodoxy was critiqued, as well as a mushy liberalism. Easy there, Anne. Easy. Okay. So this is a very interesting, balanced view, written in 1968. So with that, any comments or questions? Yes?
One thing I'm curious, and maybe this gets developed elsewhere.
Yeah.
So Augustine and a lot of these heresies all form from a discussion with the clergy and their ways. And they're ultimately, the heresies are kind of put out. Like I noticed Augustine's way of putting it out is to set like a floor, saying, look, it's not our actual clergy, it's actually Jesus Christ and whatnot. Were there contemporaneous, from the Council of Carthage, for example, attempts at even moderate reforms of the clergy during, like, okay,
No.
yes, we agree, you guys agree that it's Jesus Christ who does the sacrament dispensing,
Right.
not the priest, but we're also going to say, I don't know, an
Right.
improvement plan
Yeah.
for our clergy of some sort.
There were, and your question is a good one, because too often the way theology is taught is just looking at the canons or the theological statements of these councils. But there are decrees that are also written, or the decrees are the theological content, the canons are the disciplinary items. And these councils do have disciplinary items, and there's something like, and I'll bring the book in and you can see it, it's all the councils and all the decrees and canons. It's often like, hey, Bishop Josephus, you need to stay in your diocese and give up the other two that you have that you've never visited. And they name priests and bishops saying, hey, you can't have women living in your house. Or you have two jobs that are earning income, and then you also are charging excessive fees for stipend masses. There's a lot of canons on some priests would wander about getting mass stipends. And a lot of them could earn and live quite well just from saying masses and being paid. And then they'd move to the next town that was being underserved and so on. So you do see in these council disciplinary norms being communicated as well, and in some cases by name of the individual who's abusing his office. So, but your question is a good one, because it would be unnatural not to talk about those things. If you're going to resolve theological questions, why not then implement some of it by calling out the bad behavior? Yeah. So good question. Yes?
How did we end up with the Nicene Creed if the majority of the bishops at the council were Arians?
Because the emperor was taken aside by a certain group of Orthodox bishops and said, this is what's true to our history,
And he used his
and he agreed.
muscle to-
Right, and he agreed. And undoubtedly there were some advantages to him as well for agreeing, because he can make and unmake a bishop, they're... Yes?
What you said, it sounds like the leaders, I'll call them, the founders of these various heresies were bishops or priests.
Well,
They were
Montanus
Christians.
was not a bishop.
Oh, he was
Yeah.
not. Was he Christian?
Yes.
But he was a baptized
Yeah.
Christian.
I think I'm correct on that, but
Some of them were.
some of them were
Some of
bishops.
them were.
Yeah, and I don't think he was.
So
But-
is it that in their own belief, they grew up with some sort of Christian faith background and
Right.
teaching they were taught, do they then just say, well, this doesn't make any sense? Are they trying to analyze what they've been taught and they see a discrepancy and they try to rationalize?
I think that's too analytical. I think that they were taught many things growing up. And Christianity then, and less so now, but in some ways now. It was a mix of pagan teaching and Christianity. And there was not this rational exposition of the faith as we might think about it today, or linear thinking, A means B, B means C. What they were faced with was they were taught a Christian sensibility. They saw corruption all around them. They wondered, how can this be? And then a charismatic leader comes along and says, I'll tell you how it is. And they follow that.
Well, what's the charismatic leader? What leads him to come up with his rules, if you will?
It's a hard question to answer other than their background, their life, what motivates them.
But we don't really know.
We just know what they thought. Yeah,
Really have
right. Yeah. Other than some of the obvious, we know by what they wrote about, which was discussed with what they saw. So that's probably 75% of it. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, you had indicated when Constantine kind of became emperor that he had done a lot of positive things for the church, but some negatives. And my viewpoint of that is, were those negatives a consequence of his intentions to do good and just the fallout, or did he ever have any reason to disfavor the church's growth and development?
That is a good question. I think he did want to help the church. And I think he was unclear on how to do that, not being theologically trained. Interestingly, Charlemagne, some 500 years later, was very theologically literate. But Constantine wasn't what you'd consider a theologically literate emperor. He just wanted peace and unity, and he regarded Christianity favorably because he felt that it assisted him in becoming emperor. But sometimes you don't know how to help yourself, and you're picking sides, and his successors would pick sides. And Constantine was baptized not uncommonly on his deathbed. He had murdered people, and he was hedging and waiting to get baptized at the end. So he knew enough theology to do it that way. I'm sorry?
He was baptized by an Arian priest.
Correct. Very good. So you see, he didn't care he was an Arian priest. He was like, whatever, you bring Louis over. Right. So, yeah. Maybe one more question, then we can wrap up. Yes?
How would you differentiate between a heretic and a dynamic reformer in the church?
In 12 seconds or less.
Well, a heretic ultimately, there's always a time element, because Tertullian was a heretic and became a wonderful father of the church. But if you just take them at their points in time, a dynamic reformer would never contradict the teaching and practice of the Catholic Church. He would seek to purify it or cleanse it of evil elements, whereas a heretic will take actively positions that contradict the faith and morals of the Catholic Church, taught officially. We'll get into next class. It's a great segue. Thank you. I have a 20 for you. What's the difference between heretics and schism? So we'll cover that, and that's my teaser for next week. So the conflicts I got conflicts all over. And next class, we will talk about that split between East and West, between the Orthodox faith of the East, the Greek areas, and the Eastern Empire, and the West, and how that evolved and what were some of the key issues. So thanks everybody for coming. We'll see you next time. Thank you.